So Jay uploaded this excellent render of a light bulb on this the Bryce Talk forum and the Show Us Your Renders thread, and he mentioned in his description the difficulty of getting the glass refraction correct. Well, this raised some points about the glass material property, because in this case the bulb itself is made out of metaspheres, so it's treated as a solid object. So you need a material that simulates the glass surface, or you need to create a bulb shape which is hollowed out. I put forward some suggestions a little further down about how you might achieve this through materials, but I may not have been offering exactly the best advice there. So I've since come to test this, and the situation is a little bit more complicated than you might think. Well, depending how complicated you think the situation is. It was more complicated than I thought it was. So I went to Google Images, and I've got some images of glass bubbles, and there were these images of bowls and other things that are actually just bubbles of glass, a bit like light bulbs. You've got to be careful to pick the ones out that actually are real things and not renders. I suspect that one might be a render, I'm not sure. Renders these days can be very good. So I thought, well, I'm going to need some props to do some testing, so I made a video, here it is, and you can find it on YouTube, to make a hollow sphere. This is this glass bubble, so that's quite a thin-walled glass object. Well, it's going to be glass when I've done it in Bryce, and one of these bowls. So you can check that video out first if you want to make these props. So I'm going to use those. So here's Bryce launched in its default state, and what I'm going to begin by doing is creating a default Bryce sphere. I'll just enlarge that sphere a bit so it occupies a bit more of the screen and sort of set things up. So material wise, I'm going to begin with having we'll use glass, and find standard glass in here. So this is standard Bryce glass, and this material, it's very simple. We've got a refractive index that's appropriate for that of glass. I'm surprised it's not 153, because that's usually the one that's associated with glass. There you go, I've modified it slightly already. 100% transparent. Well, really it wouldn't be 100% transparent, but for the sake of argument let's accept that. And we've got a specular highlight which will work with the specular channel of the output of the sun. And take note of the shadow. So this shadow is not an even shadow, which is quite interesting. And so there's some simulation of the optical properties of glass here associated with this object, which may or may not be significant depending on the level of realism we're aiming for and the lighting environment. Because obviously in its default state we've just got a single light source in Bryce, the sun, which is why we expect this very bright specular highlight. Because the sky in Bryce, the default sky, is not a HDRI sky. It's actually low dynamic range, which means if we don't have this specular highlight on the glass, if we were to take the specularity away, for example, then the sun, although it's a very bright object in the sky, doesn't appear as a very bright reflection. So really, if we're going to try and simulate a glass material, we need an appropriate background that's going to look and provide the right high dynamic range lighting to work with the reflections. So to that end, I'm going to use an image, HDRI by Horo. So go image based lighting, use HDR image, open, and in here I've got this LEC roof one. I'm just going to load the lower resolution version because I'm not really worried about its appearance as a background. We just use the reflections and the light source. So okay, it's looking a bit dark, so I'm going to increase this intensity. I'm not having it as a light source for the moment, we're just looking at the reflections. So you can see the sun is a bright object in this. I'll take it up a little bit more, I'll set the blue up, I'll turn the quality down to 16 and use add to sky. The sunlight's been disabled, so I'll re-enable that, render in scene. So I'm not really worried about aligning the sun in the scene with we're just looking at reflection at the moment. This is our first consideration with materials. So I'm setting the atmosphere to fully black, so I'm just adding the HDRI to the sky, give it a quick render, and then bearing in mind now the sun is because the atmosphere is set off not visible in the sky, we've only got the sun in the background. We can now use the control key and rotate it on its axis and get it around to more or less where it is in the scene and have a look at that specular highlight. So there we go. There's no specularity in this material now because you saw me turn it down, but you can see now the sun is a very brightly reflected object. So this is sort of explaining why there's specular controls there and why it was put in there originally for Bryce. So if you've got a HDRI backdrop, because you've got the high dynamic range, you can actually get much better reflections off our glass in Bryce. So that is the first thing to consider, is we need to get our environment right. Now let's have a quick look at these images off Google Images, and let's pick some of these out. So a lot of these are interior ones. So we're looking at something like this, for example. We can see the reflection, we can't see the shadows very well. That's the other consideration. So this shadow looks like the kind of shadow we were seeing where it was bright in the middle and you were seeing the edge. But if you've got very even lighting, or a reflective surface on which the thing is stood, we're not seeing very much in the way of shadows, so that's something to consider. The surface and the lighting are all going to affect how these things appear. Let's have a look at this one. Okay, so this looks like it's not on a very reflective surface. Maybe there's a bit of reflection on the surface, but it's quite neutral, and there's no strong shadow regions. We're getting a reflection on the inside and reflection on the outside. Again, interior lighting. So I'm thinking now an interior lighting environment. So let's see, we've got open HDR image. I've got this garage open HDR. Again, I'll choose the lower resolution version. So, and this is looking a bit bright here, so I'll take this down. So at some point in this backdrop, which we're adding to the sky now, there's this open door, which is going to be my primary light source, and I've got this here. So I'm just going to Control Z. Oh, it won't go back with Control Z. Let's reset this. I think that's 90, and then press the Control key down and rotate it around so it's on its Y-axis. So I'm aiming to get the open garage door somewhere on, I'm trying to figure out where it is actually in this background. So here it's on the left, so I want it on the opposite corner, so swivel it round there. It's on the right there, so let's have a quick look at that. Re-enable the sunlight so we're getting some diffuse on the ground. Okay, so is that a reflection on the surface? Easy way to tell that is I'll get rid of the transparency and put reflection on and just check the position of that. So that's reflection on the surface, and what I'm aiming to do from the images that I've seen is get a corresponding one on the inside on the other side of this. So I go back to this as my standard glass model, and then we'll consider how we're going to make this look like a thin walled, so it's like a hollow sphere. Well, one possibility, I've just copied and pasted that. I'll move it off to one side, move the camera back a bit actually, and move the camera back and up and point it down a bit more, like so, is to Boolean operation this and then put an object without material properties inside it. So if I do Control C, Control V, and then shrink that sphere down, so I'm creating a thin walled sphere, and then make the material in this got the refractive index of 100, that is air. There's no specular response, so that's not going to throw things out. So set the attributes to negative, set the attributes of the outer sphere material to, that's going to be my glass, I don't need any specular, I need the attribute setting to positive, that's it. And then get those two together and group them. That will hollow that out. So I've just got the surface now, so we're not getting this weird refraction issue which was occurring before. So the thin wall material has a refractive index of glass, but there is something missing. There is no internal reflection of the inside. This is due to the nature of the surfaces only have one side, and that in this case this isn't helping us. The inner surface is not doing any reflection for us, but if I put on the inner surface some reflection like so, is that going to throw things out in a different way? That don't look too bad actually. I only needed a small amount of reflection, you'll note, because the high dynamic range in background is providing a lot. So the other thing to consider is that there is some attenuation in the reflection when it's coming to face the camera. This is just the grazing angle, it's Fresnel effect, and that's a bit different from just adding reflection to your object. So there is in the material lab, I'll copy this one here, a material that goes like glass bubble. So we'll have another one here and use the glass bubble material from the lab here. So in the library I've got this one here, glass bubble 2. I'm going to get rid of the specular because we don't need that now, as explained, and we've just got some reflection and some transparency, and these should roughly add up to 100. Otherwise you start to create a material that's both more transparent and more reflective, so it becomes an amplifier of light because you've created impossible material. It's a useful effect. So here we go. This is clearly too reflective for the high dynamic range background, and we're getting a lot of internal reflections, but that's actually better than that in a way. But we're getting no attenuation due to the grazing angle because of the reflection is just standard and the refraction is 100. So this is a way of getting the bubble effect with a single surface, because we don't want it to refract within the solid object, because then that makes it a lens, and it's not a lens. We're aiming for this light bulb surface, so this surface is very thin. So how can we get the grazing angle? Well, what you can do, you can set the diffuse to fully black and then use metallicity, and that'll suppress the reflection. But you can see now, because we're not fully transparent, you've got a bit of a problem. So if I make it more transparent, then we're getting over 100% between the transparency and the reflection, so you're getting some multiplication, so it might start to seem like it's glowing. So we want some shadow, but the shadow, you'll note, this is the shadow arriving from the fact that the diffuse now is set to fully black, and you don't have that effect where you've got darker edges and lighter, and so I've lost the optical property there. But the shadow is not very significant, as you might have noticed in many of these examples. The shadow is not particularly strong because you don't have a single strong point light source. Even in these where you can see the shadow, it's clear that the light source isn't a very, very compact, tiny point of light, which is why they're softened. So that's something else to take into consideration. If you start using softened light sources, then it starts to slow your render down quite considerably. So let's set the transparency at 95, which is a more realistic setting, and set the reflection down to 15. So here you can just make out the edge, which, looking at the images, that seems an appropriate thing, but we'll see how it handles the reflection. We've got no high dynamic range background in here. I wonder if we can get if we turn off render with neutral snipe, we can see that we'll get some highlights on this. So it is going to work with the high dynamic range background. Does that look more like a bubble and a very thin layer of glass? Well, I would say yes. We've got this attenuation in the middle, so that does sort of work, though I'm not sure about the shadow situation. I mean, I suppose that seems appropriate. Perhaps the answer here is to upgrade the type of lighting we're using. So I'll disable the sunlight and then bring in high dynamic range lighting, and then try and set it at an appropriate level so it doesn't look overly bright. Okay. Now what you will find, if you start to increase the reflection too much, is this edge will become obvious, because it's picking up reflections internally of the ground surface which is lit, and then you're getting a bit of that reflected back. Remember all the inner reflections you had when the reflection was very high. So if you turn the reflection up much higher, you'll get a lot of internal reflections. Now there's another consideration here, which is one of in terms of render optimization, is we've got, with a boolean, we've got two surfaces going on, and this is going to start to eat into the maximum ray depth. You might have noticed, I don't know, in the nano preview, it's rather small, so probably not, that this one looks very dark compared with how it appears in the render, and that's because nano preview is set at a maximum ray depth of 3. So if we do that here, you'll see that as the ray's travelling through 4 surfaces, it's not getting out the other side, so it returns black. So there is another consideration. So you are starting to use up your maximum ray depths if you model things in this way. Now, speaking of models then, let us bring in one of the models that I prepared. So let's file import object, and see if we can find my model. So here's my hollow sphere. So I'll bring that one in, and while I'm at it, I'll import the other object, so our bowl. So those are the two objects that I prepared, so in Wings 3D. So I'm going to just enlarge them so they're a comparable scale to the other things, and then I'll move my hollow sphere off to the left and my bowl off to the right. So let's have a look how these look now. Okay, I'll put standard glass on both these objects, and so I'm just transferring the material. First one object is selected, and the next one, if I select the material, I'll have it all going together. And we'll see now So this is a mesh object that's been, and so is this, that should have the appropriate properties if we provide the right materials to look realistic. So the aim then would be to get this one, which is our best bet, and that one looking alike. So it looks like I need to lower the reflection. So let's lower the reflection. Let's try 15 as I was before, but I think that's going to look a bit low compared with that one. And then we'll have the talk about how the ground's getting reflected in one case and not in the other. So this outer edge looks dark. If anything, I would say this material, this glass, looks a bit heavy, and this one looks a bit on the light side. So it's possible we could do with some refraction in this, but if we do that, we're going to start getting curves. But you can see here and here, if you pay close attention, there is some refraction taking place due to the light entering the material, going through a thin wall of glass, leaving it again, going through the void in the middle of this sphere, then exiting again. So some refraction's going to help us here. So let's see which way we're going to go with this. Let's try 110. We'll take the refraction up and see what happens. Okay, the refraction's gone up and it's too high, and also the curves in sort of the opposite direction to which you might expect, because here's our lens, so it might mean that we need to go under, which will be handy because it'll mean that we won't have the problem with the diffuse colour. So let's take the refraction down to 90 and see what effect that has. Okay, so we've got the curve going in the right way for these, so we need to push that up a bit. So it's obviously too extreme, so we'll go for I've got a sinking feeling about this. I think if I check back to what Jay was saying here, he set his refractive index. Where did he say? He showed me the material. This is a very good render. Anyway, that's beside the point. Here, what did he set it as? 99. So yes, I've finally come to the same conclusion that he'd already come to. So as I say, my advice wasn't very good as it happened. So I've tried 98. Let's have a look how that matches. It's sort of like this one. So it depends on the thickness of your glass. If your glass is very thin, then yeah, probably 99 is a good choice. I'm going to use that value there. So I've got 99, and that's looking about right there. Probably need a little bit more reflection. I should just look at Jay's material, shouldn't I? Let's find it. Let's see what reflection. I used quite a low reflection, but he had got his transparency, and I don't think you'll be getting much from the refractive index in terms of reflection here. Okay, so let's go. Let's try 35. Might be a bit much. We'll see how much it lights up. See, this outer edge is lighting up, and this is coming from the ground, and this edge is darker, so there's a bit of a difference. And the pattern there, well, I suppose the position's different, so I mean, to have to swap these places. We'll move it over there temporarily and see whether the pattern changes. Yeah, it's okay, it's just positioning that's changing the pattern of lights. That's our viewing angle. So maybe that was a bit of a high reflection. So we'll take it down to 30 and see how that goes. Okay, right. Not too bad. So now the question is, how should the edge of it look? Well, to get it more like the examples we've seen, you should probably give some reflection on the ground as well. It might be a bit too much because it's reflections everywhere. Let's take that really down to 5. And then we're going to have to start thinking about using premium effects like dispersing the reflection on the ground surface but remaining sharp reflections on there. So if we wanted sharp reflections on the materials, you've got to bear in mind that the specular halo will be the thing that determines how sharp they are or how blunt they are. So we want it to be set fully black for ones we want sharp reflections on, and then at a higher value. So the default value here might be appropriate for this, because that's going to be a bit blurred there. So let's go through all our materials now and modify the specular halo. Right, want the sphere 2, so specular halo there and there. So that's that fully black, and then we can use blurred reflections. So this material here, full black, and on our glass bowl, which we've not meddled with yet, we've just been had it in there in the corner to look at. Now we'll go render options, premium effects, and we'll use blurred reflections. Take this down. It's going to take a while. This is at the point at which we can optimize. We can try a maximum ray depth of 4 and hope that's going to work, apart from where it transmits through these surfaces. So that's blurred the reflections there. And while we're at it, then we could also employ soft shadows. Now we've gone to premium effects, it won't be too much of an overhead. Switch to soft shadows. So I'm going to have to spread these out a bit so that they're not colliding too much, because this has become an issue. I suppose what I could do is just shrink them down and then lift the ground up to meet them. That'll spread them out evenly. There we go. And then narrow the field of view. And to make it more efficient on the rendering, if I change it to a sort of a slot shaped render, so let's take that down to 500. Don't constrain the proportions. What was that before? Let's try 1000. So that's a 2:1 ratio, and then we'll see how that looks. Right, this glass is looking quite heavy, and these all look a bit too heavy and dark on the outside. I don't think that one's looking too bad, but given we've gone on quite a while now, I think we'll just have a quick modification of this. To make the glass lighter, we can lower the refractive index, but that changes its optical properties as well, so you just got to be a bit careful of that. So let's try 135 and see what effect that has in terms of the material, its appearance, as how heavy it makes it look as a glass. So lower the refractive index again. It's not having a radical difference on its appearance at the moment, but it will do when it gets closer to that of air. So this has lightened the glass now, you can see that, and I think that's looking more like the glass we're seeing in these images, even though its refractive index isn't exactly correct. In the background I've been rendering away with Octane to see what it makes of this challenge using its glass properties, but that's another story. This say is looking a bit dark, and I've not even used the effect, because I've got grazing angle built into the transparency. I don't really need to use the metallicity to reduce the effective reflection where it's facing the camera. What I could do is I could make it a little bit less transparent, or give it a colour to tint the colour of the glass as appropriate. But I think the things to do now is give this a final render. I might use depth of field as well while I'm at it, and see how these look, and then we might return to this topic again when we've considered the effects of the changes that we've made. So let's see, render options set to current selection. See how much depth of field effect that's put into it. Not a lot, they're all in focus. So render options, I'll raise this value. It's usually enough, but it all depends on the size of your objects and the field of view you're using. Okay, that's softened the background a bit. Right, let us set this up. Let's see what it's going to be like at 64. Render time of 4 minutes, that's not too bad. I wonder what the noise level is going to be like. The worst thing is likely to be the shadows always looking quite noisy, so as is often the case, the best thing to do is to go for the maximum available, see how long it's going to take, and then we'll well, I'll put this at the beginning of the video and you can see what the results of these tests have been. So there you go, a rather long-winded and inconclusive test of the glass materials and some of the optical properties that you need to consider when making glass materials in Bryce. So I hope you found that interesting and potentially useful, and at some point we'll return to this topic and see if we can produce something that looks a bit more realistic than we have so far. Cheers now.